It is my pleasure to interview George Anastasia today. George is an American author and was a longtime writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer. He is widely considered to be an expert on the American Mafia. He was an organized crime investigative reporter who was once targeted for death by then Philadelphia crime family boss John Stanfa. He has twice been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and has won the Sigma Delta Chi Award. He was also been described on a 60 Minutes television profile as one of the most respected crime reporters in the country.
I'm George Anastasia. I'm a former reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Covered organized crime for many, many years. I've written several books, and now I'm kind of a freelance crime reporter and an author. A made man is somebody who's been formally initiated into our crime family. There are a lot of associates who aren't made. To be made, it used to be made, you had to be involved in a murder. Set a guy up, shoot the guy, get rid of the body. That's kind of changed as things have evolved. But a made guy undergoes a formal initiation ceremony. They call it a making ceremony. You prick your trigger finger, your blood trickles onto a holy card. You put the holy card in your hand, they cup it, they light the card on fire, and while it's turning to ash, you swear to live and die for the family, and may you burn like this saint if you betray members of the family. So it's a blood oath, formal initiation. It's very, it's almost a religious kind of experience in terms of the pomp and circumstance. That used to be a very, very formal and secret thing. Now we know so much about it because so many people who have been part of this have become witnesses, and now it's almost like pop culture. I mean, everybody knows the ceremony, everybody knows the details. It's no longer this secret and sacred procedure. Everybody knows about it. The whole criteria for being a made guy has changed. Originally, it was the Mafia. Cosa Nostra was a Sicilian organization. You had to be Sicilian. Then it became you had to be Italian on both sides, your mother and your father. As it's evolved, there's been guys who have gotten made who were only half Italian. Old timers are probably rolling in their graves over that, but that's, it's no longer this very exclusive Italian men's club. It's not that anymore. Angelo Bruno was, number one, very much laissez-faire. And part of the reason for that, I think, was Angelo Bruno already had more money than he needed. So it wasn't that kind of competitive situation, grab the money with both fists. The other thing, I think Angelo Bruno was a boss who, ruled with an iron fist but covered it with a velvet glove. There are ways to diplomatically get what you want. And Bruno understood about give and take. Bruno understood about diplomacy. Bruno understood that you don't get to have everything immediately. Scarfo, on the other hand, ruled with the iron fist, saw no need for the velvet glove. Scarfo used murder as a calling card rather than something of last resort. I mean, with Angelo Bruno, Bruno has this reputation as the docile Don. And that's almost nonsense. And that only came after he had been killed, and the guys that came after him were more violent than he. But violence occurred during Bruno's reign as mob boss. It's just that murder was a negotiating tool of last resort. If everything else failed, somebody might get popped. With Scarfo, when Scarfo was the boss, murder was almost a calling card. Anybody that crossed Scarfo ended up in the crosshairs. And that was kind of the difference in management style, and it's one of the reasons I think that the Philadelphia crime family became so destabilized during the Scarfo era. There's no longer, you don't have room for error anymore if you're out there, if you're a wise guy. If you screw up and you piss off Scarfo, you might end up dead. And it's a different kind of management style and a different approach to the way things ought to play out. And it creates for more violence, I think. Number one, Scarfo was paranoid, and I think there was paranoia across that whole family at that particular time. If you look at the situation, Bobby Simone is Nicky Scarfo's lawyer, and Bobby Simone is George Mortorano's lawyer. George Mortorano gets a terrible deal, and if you want to talk about conspiracies and you want to get into why did that happen? There are some people who say, yes, Scarfo influenced Simone and that's why it played out that way. It made no sense to me, and it still makes no sense to me, that you're charged with being a kingpin, you're looking at life in prison if you're convicted, you agree to plead out, and you still get life. It doesn't make any sense. It never happens that way. Usually if you plead out, you're going to get a break of some sort from at sentencing. That's just the way it is. Or else, why bother to plead out? Why would you plead out and get maxed? Well, you might as well go to trial, take your shot with the jury. That's what was so bizarre about this case. Not that he was convicted, not that he was a kingpin, not that he got a serious sentence. The bizarre nature of this was, had he gone to trial, the most he could have gotten was life in prison. When he opted not to go to trial and plead out, he still got life in prison. Makes no sense. Yeah, street tax. I mean, Scarfo, again, this is Scarfo as mob boss, Scarfo as taking no prisoners, Scarfo as grab money with both fists. Anybody who was doing anything in the underworld during Scarfo's era, if you're a bookmaker, if you're a loan shark, if you're dealing drugs, if you're not affiliated with the family, if you don't have a connection, then you've got to pay a street tax to the mob. And that's, you know, if you're a bookmaker, they want a piece of your action. If you're a loan shark, they want a piece of what you're giving. Now, the interesting thing about that, Scarfo had this reputation as this violent, tough guy. But there were people out there who weren't paying a street tax. Basically, were saying this: the bikers didn't pay, some of the black gangs didn't pay. And the reason for that was they weren't afraid of Scarfo. And Scarfo, supposed to be this tough guy, backed away from that. He wasn't going to go after anybody that might shoot back at him. So he had this rep as a tough guy, but it really was, he was a bully and an intimidator. But if somebody stood up to him, by and large, he would back away. We saw that with the pagans. You know, they were serious players, and they weren't going to give a street tax to Scarfo. And we saw it with some of the black organized crime gangs. You know, they weren't going to give money to the mafia. George Mortorano's situation was unique in that he and his father had established a relationship with Angelo Bruno. And I think that gave them status, even after Bruno was gone. Now, Scarfo wanted a piece of everybody's action, so I think Georgie had a tap dance around that. But I think those guys, the Mortoranos, were so established in what they did that I don't want to say they got a free pass, but they were able to maneuver and operate almost at a higher level than Scarfo. Scarfo wasn't even working at that level in terms of the drug underworld. These guys were, you know, they were major players, and that's one of the things. You know, what we see now is somewhat revisionist history. You know, George Mortorano, 32 years in prison, the longest non-violent criminal to serve all that time, and basically the spin is, the narrative from his camp is, he was basically a marijuana dealer. Well, you look at the charges, look at the case. It was cocaine, it was heroin, it was meth, it was a $75 million operation, connections to the black mafia, connections all over Philadelphia. I mean, he was very entrepreneurial, give him that, very good at what he did, but I don't think anybody's buying the argument that he was just this high-level marijuana dealer, and look what happened to him. He got persecuted by the government. You know, he was a major kingpin, and he was facing serious charges. And as I said, the only bizarre nature in all of this is, how does he get maxed out when he pleads out? Long John Mortorano was powerful only because he had Angelo Bruno's ear. Long John Mortorano's power and strength came from Bruno. He was Bruno's guy. I mean, and this, you know, this adds to another one of the hypocrisy about Philadelphia back in the 80s. Angelo Bruno had this ban on drugs. Nobody's supposed to deal drugs. Nobody in the organization. Bruno didn't want drug dealers, right? His number one guy, his driver, the guy he's with, the guy who he's in business with, is a major drug dealer. So that's kind of the hypocrisy of Angelo Bruno, and I think a lot of guys in the Bruno organization who saw opportunities to make drugs, make money from dealing drugs, and who were banned by Bruno from dealing drugs, did it on a sneak. And ultimately, I think Bruno was killed because of that hypocrisy. You know, I mean, Bruno, in addition to Long John, in the late 70s, Rosario and Giuseppe Gambino came down from New York and opened a supper club in Cherry Hill called Valentino's. They were the distant cousins of Carlo Gambino, the boss in New York. Carlo Gambino and Angelo Bruno were like this. So Rosario and Giuseppe Gambino show up in Cherry Hill. Rosario and Giuseppe Gambino are part of the infamous Sicilian heroin connection, the pizza connection. This is an international multi-million-dollar drug operation. Now they set up shop in Cherry Hill, and Bruno welcomes them to basically his territory. And then, and I know this pissed a lot of guys off, Bruno has the Gambino brothers over to his house for Easter dinner. I think it's in 1979. And the guys within Bruno's organization say, you know, this is an honor to be invited to the boss's house. And there's no doubt they're bringing an envelope. And that's drug money, and Bruno's happy to take that money. But he's telling us don't deal drugs. So he's a hypocrite. And Bruno's consigliere, Tony Bananas Caponegro, supposedly the guy who shot Bruno, or killed Bruno. Caponegro was dealing heroin up in Newark on the sneak. And he saw this with the Gambino showing up, and he said, what the hell is this? What's going on here? You know, let's play by the rules, or there are no rules. Bruno wanted it both ways. And I think that's why Bruno got killed. But the Mortoranos were Bruno's original drug connection. Much as he said, oh, I don't want to deal drugs, nobody deal drugs. Here's Long John and Long John's son making millions of dollars. And nobody believes that we're making that kind of money and not giving Angelo a piece. You know, nobody believes that. So that's the hypocrisy of Angelo Bruno. Listen, I think you've got to give George Mortorano credit for what he did once he was incarcerated. A lot of guys, you know, wither on the vine, they die, emotionally they die. That didn't happen with George Mortorano. George Mortorano became a writer, became an advocate for other prisoners, became a counselor. I mean, these were all things, I think, that go to his character, the kind of the entrepreneurial nature of this guy and the intelligence of this guy. Not to say he wasn't a kingpin, because he was, and that's the one thing I can't get on board with, is this spin that, oh, look at this poor guy was persecuted. But not many guys in prison, for as long as he was in prison, were able to create a whole nother persona built around his ability to write, his ability to tell stories, his ability to counsel people, and all of those things, I think, worked to his benefit after 32 years, when people started to clamor for, you know, this guy should be let out. I think all of that was to his advantage. You got to give him that. And again, I don't want to underscore who he was and what he did out on the streets. But once he got in prison and he saw, you know, I mean, he made the best of his situation, probably better than almost 90% of the guys that go to prison. This is my situation. How do I make the best of it? And he figured out a way to do it. Hannum as a character witness for Bobby Simone at Bobby Simone's trial. Right, and that raises, you know, what is this? Bobby Simone's a well-known mob lawyer. Why is this judge standing up? Now, Hannum's got to sentence a mobster, George Mortorano. So is he bend over backwards to look like he's not cutting a deal? That there's not something untoward here? That may be part of, you know, I don't know what was in the judge's mind at the time. What I'm saying is, if that was the case, it wasn't fair to Mortorano. There's no doubt in my mind that Mortorano got a bad deal when he got life after pleading guilty. And was Hannum doing that because he didn't want to be perceived as in the mob's pocket? You know, I mean, the smarter thing would have been, he should have recused himself. He should have said, look, I testified on behalf of this defense attorney. I can't sentence his defendant. Bring it in front of another judge. That would be the right way to go. It didn't happen. So this is a kind of a convoluted case in terms of what happened to George Mortorano. And I think part of it is this whole relationship between the judge, Hannum, and the defense attorney, Bobby Simone. If Hannum was close to John McCullough was very close to Angelo Bruno. John McCullough gets killed shortly after Bruno gets killed, and that comes from Scarfo. I mean, you've got a lot of tentacles going in a lot of different directions here. And does that influence the judge in terms of how he perceives a mobster? If he's a friend with an individual who was killed in a mob hit? Again, it's a question of, if those things existed, Hannum probably should have recused himself from this case. When John Stanford was the boss in Philadelphia, he apparently did not like a lot of the stuff I was writing and basically put a hit out on me. But I didn't find out about it till after a couple years later, when Stanford and the guy who was supposed to kill me were incarcerated. And I get this phone call. I'm at the Inquirer, and I get a phone call from prison, collect phone call from Sergio Battaglia, this young kid, who's being indicted with Stanford and has now decided to cooperate. And he calls me on the phone and he says, listen, there's some stuff going to come out about you. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, back in the day, Stanford told me to get some hand grenades, find out where you live and throw them through the window. And he said, I want you to let you know it was nothing personal. I said, well, Sergio, I got a wife and 2 kids, hand grenades come through my window, it's very personal. And he says to me, well, by the time I got the grenades, we were so caught up in the war with Joey Merlino that we stopped looking for you. So, I mean, that's the only time I had a real problem, and I think it was unique in that Stanford was born and raised in Sicily. And it's a whole different set of rules in Sicily. Judges, prosecutors, reporters, if you're not with them, you're against them. You're fair game. And so judges have been killed in Sicily. Reporters have been tracked and killed in Sicily. In America, that's not the case. Nicky Scarfo never liked me, but I don't think he'd ever think about putting a hit out on me, because it would create more heat than it wouldn't solve any problems. It would generate more problems. I think Scarfo kind of realized that. A guy like Angelo Bruno tolerated the media. Guys like Joey Merlino and those guys, they seemed to love the media attention. It was unique that at that particular time, which was in the, I guess, mid-90s, early 90s, Stanford was the boss, and he had the Sicilian mindset. So I think it was an aberration that somebody put a hit out on me. That's the only time I had a problem that I'm aware of, and I didn't find out about it till a couple years after the fact. I mean, I think the FBI has not been happy with everything I've written. The FBI it's a funny organization. They're the 500-pound gorilla. They want to control everything. So if you're writing a story that is about something they don't want out in the public, they'll get upset about it. But my job wasn't to worry about whether the mob liked me or not, whether the FBI liked me or not. My job was just to report on what I was finding out and tell the story. You know, the other thing about this is, I mean, I was very fortunate that I was working at the Inquirer at a time when we had a lot of resources and a lot of time. I mean, good reporting is labor intensive. So we had, you know, lots of reporters doing lots of stories, and I could go out on a story and say, you know what, it's not there yet. I need a couple more days. And the editor would say, yeah, go ahead, don't worry about it. That doesn't exist today. Today it's a 24/7 news cycle, fewer resources, and I'm not sure that anybody could be able to develop the kind of beat now that I developed back then, because I had the time and I had the backing of the people running the paper. It doesn't exist anymore. The other thing is, and this is kind of about reporting. I mean, you know, there's a lot of people in my business that was an investigative reporter and the search for the truth. Yeah, and that's all true. But at the end of the day, you know, we're not practicing brain surgery. We're not finding a cure for cancer. I mean, what our goal is as a reporter is enlighten, inform, and maybe entertain. Tell a good story. Be honest and be truthful. But tell it in a way that it's got I mean, that's what I tried to do. A story with a narrative, a beginning, a middle, and an end that people would want to read. That's what I think reporters are about. You can't get caught up in all the hoop-de-doo of, you know, we're gonna write injustice. Yeah, that's part of what you do. But don't get so caught up in that you lose sight of, you know what, we're minor players in the greater scheme of things. Dave Gentile was an FBI agent working Philadelphia when I wrote my first mob book, Blood and Honor, about Nick Caramandi. Dave was an immense help in terms of the relationship I developed with Caramandi, and Dave was a guy who I always could depend on to run stuff past him. You know, he wouldn't violate any restrictions from the FBI, but you know, he would basically be there. Look, Dave, I'm hearing this. Nick's saying that. What do you think? And he would steer me in the right direction. Very good guy. I've known him since then. He's always been a help. People don't realize this. In the Italians, the Jews, and the Irish come to this country in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and try to get a leg up in America. And the Irish had one thing going for them that the other two didn't. They spoke English. And the other thing was they were perceived as more white than the Jews and the Italians. So all of those things factored in. So in terms of law enforcement, traditionally, you've always had more Irish in law enforcement than you've had Italian. And I think that was true in the FBI as well as local police departments. So yeah, I think there's always been something, you know, a rivalry or a perception or a bias. Yeah, I think some of that exists, but that's human nature. It exists in almost every walk of life, you know? Yeah, I mean, the five families are the five families in New York City. And New York, for so many different reasons, is the center of the universe. And in terms of organized crime, it's the center of the universe. Most cities have one family. Philadelphia, it's been the Bruno family, the Scarfo family, the Philadelphia family. New York has five families, and they're named after the old-time mob bosses, Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese and Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo. Those are the names that are still linked to the five families in New York. So New York is unique in that respect, that they've got five organized crime families, each operating within the city, and then, you know, tentacles stretching out. For example, I mean, we talk about New York and New York City. New Jersey is probably the one state, maybe with the exception of Nevada and Florida, the one state that has multiple mob families with roots in the state. The five New York families, the Philadelphia families always had a crew in Newark and big in South Jersey, and then the indigenous, the Cavalcanti crime family. So, yeah, I mean, the five families dominate, but every city that has had a strong Italian ethnic community at one time or another has had a mob family. The best mob movies. Godfather 1 and 2 are the classics. Great cinema. Realism, Donnie Brasco and Goodfellas, right? My personal favorites, The Pope of Greenwich Village and The Friends of Eddie Coyle. Now, there are two movies that not a lot of people know that much about, but they're more stories about life in the underworld from street level. The Friends of Eddie Coyle is a great movie. Robert Mitchum, 1973, I think it was. It was overshadowed by the Godfather movies back then. Very, very good. The Pope of Greenwich Village, Mickey Rourke, Eric Roberts, is just a classic. But both of those are almost anecdotal stories about individuals in the life, whereas the Godfather movies were sprawling, almost operatic, and Goodfellas and Donnie Brasco, I think, were the most realistic. Scorsese really tapped into the whole Italian culture, I think, in any movie that he did about the mob. It's that kind of overlap of religion, authority, violating authority, codes of honor, sin, forgiveness, all of that. I mean, Scorsese tapped into all of that. What I'm going to say may sound sacrilegious, but The Irishman was, let's get the band back together for one more time, number one. Number two, I don't believe Frank Sheeran was the guy who killed Jimmy Hoffa. So I think they bought into a premise that doesn't hold up. And I also think that if The Irishman had been Scorsese's first mob movie, it wouldn't have had the kind of following that it got, because basically everybody knew this is the last go-round for all of these guys and we're going to go watch this movie. It was okay. It wasn't great. Nobody's done justice to the Philadelphia story cinematically. Never. Nobody has. It just sits there. And maybe because it's in the shadow of New York. Now you've got, I mean, Boston has become the big center for all kind of movies and TV series, I think because of Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. Nobody does justice to Philadelphia. It's never happened. No, I mean, you know, you got Silver Lining Playbook is a great movie about Philadelphia, but it has nothing to do with the mob. There's been other movies, but none have captured the Philadelphia underworld and the story that we've been talking about. Villa Di Roma is a South Philadelphia institution. I mean, it's been here on 9th Street forever. Everybody knows it. Second, third generation people are still coming here. The food is great. It's part of South Philadelphia. The interesting thing when you talk about all this kind of stuff is the mob has always been a part of South Philadelphia. It's not what South Philadelphia is, but it's a part of it, and you can't deny that. I mean, I get in discussions and people get upset with me because, I'm an Italian American and I'm writing about organized crime and I'm reinforcing this stereotype that all Italians are gangsters. That's not the case. I mean, second and third generation Italian Americans, the best and the brightest are doctors, lawyers, educators, filmmakers, and the mob scraping the bottom of the gene pool. That's why it's deteriorated to such a great degree. But you can't deny that it existed. You can't deny that it was for a long time an institution down here. Now, Villa Di Roma has outlasted all of that. So has these other great stores on 9th Street. But the mob has always been a part of this place. It's no longer the dominant monolithic institution in South Philadelphia that it was, say, in the 40s and the 50s. But it's still here to a lesser degree. Sicily is one of the more fascinating places in the world.
Yes.
If you look at the history of Sicily, it's an island nation that's always been dominated by outsiders.
Yes.
And I think there's one of the reasons I think the Mafia evolved out of that is you can't trust authority, you can't trust anybody else but your family. That's where it comes from. Whether it's the French or the Moors or the Spanish, somebody from outside has always controlled Sicily. And I think that's that whole mindset of you got to look out for yourself, omerta, to be a man. You take care of your own problems. You don't trust authority. And the Mafia, grew out of that, and then it became, it took these values of honor and loyalty and bastardized them, and they became thugs and gangsters, both in Sicily and here. But the history of Sicily, to understand the Mafia, you got to understand the history of Sicily. Now, you talk about Italians, and then you got a whole distinction between northern Italy and southern Italy. There's bias. You got to, then you've got different. People who aren't Italian don't understand the ethnicity within the ethnicity. For example, my wife is Sicilian on her father's side and Abruzzese on her mother's side, and we've been in Abruzzo. And she says, and I think rightly so, the best cooks in Italy are from Abruzzo. They just do everything well. You talk to somebody who's Napolitan from Naples, or somebody who's a Calabrese. It depends on where you're from. And you're still Italian, in a broad sense. But if you get a bunch of Italians sitting around talking, then they're going to argue about who makes the best food. Where does it come from? You know, that's I think unique to Italy. I mean, I lived in France for a while. I didn't see that kind of distinction of, you know, northern and southern France, and there was Parisians in the rest of the world, yeah. But I mean, in terms of the kind of distinctions I see in Italy, is very, very regional and almost provincial. And then the north versus the south has been historic. I mean, the south has always been put upon. Abruzzo, it's from Abruzzo, the province of Abruzzo. My wife's family is from Taranto. It's a small city, almost on the Adriatic. It's about 2 hours east of Rome. It's a great province. I mean, and the food is really good. But you know, you go up and down. You Marchigiani, Puglia, anywhere they're going to argue their food is better. That's what Stanley Tucci's tapping into that with the CNN series is, you know, Finding Italy. That's what it's all about. It's Italy is not red sauce, you know. Italy is not just pizza. You go to Sicily, the food is totally different. You know, a lot of fish, a lot of interesting tastes that are influenced by the Moors that controlled Sicily for a while, by the Spanish, by the French. It's a whole different kind of culture. The Mafia grew out of Sicily. Now, there's also organized crime groups in southern Italy. In Naples, it's the Camorra. In Calabria, it's the 'Ndrangheta. In Puglia, it's the Sacra Corona Unita. So you've got different organized crime groups operating within these different sections of southern Italy. The Mafia, in a lot of ways, the word Mafia, has become a catch-all. Now you hear about the Russian Mafia, the Asian Mafia, the Black Mafia. Everybody wants to be Mafia because the Mafia is perceived now as an organized crime group. So it's almost become a generic phrase now. So the Mafia out of Sicily. Where does the word Mafia come from? I don't think anybody really knows. Some people say it's a derivative of two Arabic words that meant men that hid in caves. Because in the early days, the Mafia, the guys went up into the hills. Some people say, and this can't be true, it's an acronym for Morte alla Francese Italianella. Death to the French, Italy cries, right? This would have been when the French controlled Sicily. So the problem with that was in the 15th and 16th century, there was no Italy. Italy was unified in 1861. So Italy's not going to be crying in the 15th century. Sicily might be crying. And so that leads me to there's another very romantic version of where the word Mafia comes from. The French are controlling Sicily, and in this small village, there's a wedding, and on the wedding night, the French soldiers in the garrison take the bride and rape her, have their way with her. They exercise their right to seigneur in the village, and her mother goes running through the village, screaming, "My daughter, my daughter." Now Sicilians swallow a lot of the consonants, so instead of "ma figlia," she's saying "mafia, mafia," and the men of the village rise up, slaughter the garrison, and then disappear into the hills. And they're called the Mafia, Mafia. Now, I don't think that's any more true than any of the others, but it's certainly the most romantic version of where the word Mafia come from. And I think a lot of people like to play off of that the Mafia, these men of honor, you know, this society of honorable men who do the right thing. I don't know if that ever existed, but that's certainly the myth of the Mafia. They're there to protect their own. Now, you know, in modern day America, the Mafia has taken those values, honor, loyalty, and bastardized them to their own end to justify what they do. There's no more honor. It's greed and treachery. That's what it is. And murder.